Why am I nervous? Hi everyone, it's Caroline or Miss B Overseas. Thanks so much for joining me today. I'm going to be wrapping up all of the books that I read not only in March, but also in February. I really allowed myself to fall into this vicious cycle where I would sit down intending to film my TBR and then also the wrap up, just kind of back to back. And I would get to the end of my TBR and be like, you know what? That's good. We don't need to film our wrap up. We can do that later. And then it would just get later and later into the month. So that's where we are right now. I have 12 books to talk about today, which I realize that for a lot of people, that's just like a typical month's wrap up. Not me though. I average around like 5 or 6 books a month. It's just very intimidating that I am going to try to not only remember what happened in all of these books, but try to put articulate and coherent thoughts together about all of these books. So please bear with me. I don't know how long this is going to be. I also don't really know how I'm going to format this in terms of the order that I talk about these books, because normally what I do is I can just remember the order in which I read them, and that's typically the order in which I wrap them up, but I don't remember really the order that I read these in, and for some reason it just doesn't feel right. So I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to just invent categories. It's not going to be typical categories like star rankings or genres, because those would make sense. They're just going to be categories that I come up with off the top of my head. So the first category is going to be books that I am going to direct you to another video to hear my complete and in-depth thoughts, which is my Finishathon reading vlog. It will be linked somewhere up here or down there, and you can go watch that for my in-depth thoughts on these 3 lovely books. These are all books that I had previously started, and just for whatever reason I had not finished them, so I used that week to finish up all of these books, and I'm so grateful to that readathon for forcing me to read all of these books. I'll just tell you a brief tidbit about each of them. The first one is Dactyl Hill Squad by Daniel Jose Older. This is a middle grade action adventure historical Civil War retelling, and it's just the perfect amount of found family and adventure, but it also brings up really untalked about and unlearned about parts of Civil War history, particularly about the slave trade that went on in the North. It brings up really good learning experiences and just topics of conversation, but then it does it in this reimagined Brooklyn where dinosaurs like live and breathe and walk the earth. So just a combination of a bunch of really awesome things, and I ended up giving this one 4 stars. I talk about this in my vlog as like a personal preference reader. This probably wouldn't get 4 stars, but just because I know that I am going to have such success and have had such success already with recommending this to my students, and just what this book is and what it's going to be for them, it gets 4 stars if it makes sense. And if not, that's okay too. Next up for that video, I read The House in the Cerulean Sea by TJ Klune. Come on, at this point, you know the drill with this one. Magical island, whimsical, fantastical children. This kind of social worker has to go to this island unplanned, and while he is there, he learns more about himself and the world around him through these experiences he has with these lovely, fantastic, heartwarming, magical children. This book absolutely lived up to its hype, if not exceeded its hype. I loved it for all of the reasons that everyone talks about, but one of the things that really stuck with me was that this reminded me of when I was a young kid and I was just experiencing what it meant to get lost in the magical world of a book. I haven't felt that feeling since probably reading when I was younger, like in junior high or high school, and to feel that again as an adult just hits different. And I think that TJ Klune was very intentional in his writing with this being able to elicit and evoke those sort of emotions in adult readers. Even though I think this is marketed as an adult book, I think it definitely could read younger. There's lots of age ranges that would enjoy this, and I loved it 4 out of 5 stars. And the next one that I finished during that vlog, actually I think might have ended up being my favorite of the 3 that I finished that week, which is The Night Tiger by Yangsze Choo. This is historical fiction that takes place in Malaysia, but it's also a little bit magical and a little bit folkloric. It's focusing on really 2 characters' perspectives that at the beginning they're very separate, but then as the story kind of winds further and further together, their lives and their experiences get closer and closer together. And both of the characters' kind of plot lines center around this missing finger, and that's kind of where the folklore of this comes in, because this doctor that has died needs to be buried with his whole body and his finger has gone missing. There is were-tigers in here, which I loved. There is mysterious occurrences that keep popping up, but no one's necessarily trying to solve those mysterious occurrences. I listened to this primarily on audiobook, which I highly recommend that audiobook. Yangsze Choo narrates it, and her voice just captures the tone of the story so well. I think that this was magical and ethereal and slow, but in all of the best slow burn kind of ways that a book like this can read, and I loved it a lot, and I gave this one 4 out of 5 stars as well. Okay, so that was the first category of books. The second category of books I'm going to name books that are from genres that are outside of my comfort zone. Some of that went really well for me and some of it really didn't. So let's talk about what went well and what didn't go well. First up in this category is In 5 Years by Rebecca Serle. This is an adult contemporary romance, although I think that I would probably more genreify it as an adult contemporary that has some romantic scenes. The pitch for this that you've probably heard before and what I got pitched to me was it's about this woman who very much has always had a plan for her life. She knew where she was going to live. She knows who she's going to be married to. She knows just what her life is going to look like. On the night that she gets engaged to her long-term boyfriend, she ends up going back to the place where they live, and she falls asleep and she has this very visceral dream that's about her life, but 5 years from that point, and it's nothing that she expects, not living where she thought she was going to live, and she is married to not her fiance at the time, but this man that she had never met before. She wakes up from that dream, lives her life out, then 5 years later, she meets this literal man of her dreams, and then things kind of play out from there. I don't really know that mine is the opinion that you want on this book. I read it really quickly. The readability of this author's writing was really fantastic, which I know kind of sounds like I'm scraping for a compliment, but it is really hard, I think, to write something that reads as easily as this one did. Really loved the author's descriptions of New York in this book. I think that if you are a reader who looks for New York settings, you will be satisfied by the setting in this one. My one kind of gripe with this, and this didn't affect really my enjoyment of it or my star rating, which was 3 stars, let's just say that right now. But this pitch for this book, what I just said to you and what you've probably heard about this, isn't really what the book is about. I'm discovering about myself more and more as a reader that I don't like bait and switch in my contemporary. I think that's why I don't really like domestic thrillers. If a book is pitched as one thing, that's what I want it to be. And this book's pitch doesn't really match what it is about. And I know that I may seem like I'm being kind of vague. I do kind of want to avoid spoilers, but I hate the fact that what I'm avoiding would be considered a spoiler at all. I will say that this is less about the main character's romantic relationships and really more about female friendship and the power of friendship and kind of the deepness and soul connection that you can feel to your friends, I guess, if that makes sense. I do think that this book deals heavily with grief, and I think that if you know that you need content warnings for kind of things surrounding grief, I would look up content warnings for this. Again, it didn't affect my overall rating, but even like the tagline, it says this is a love story, but not the love story you're expecting. And they try to pull something off as like a twist in here, and it just didn't sit right with me. So 3 stars overall. Again, mine isn't really the opinion I think that you want on this. I think that this does probably what other adult kind of romantic contemporaries do, and it was a stretch outside my comfort zone. Okay, next up from books that are from genres that are I don't typically read from or outside my comfort zone is Lovely War by Julie Berry. This is young adult historical fiction, which normally I just kind of don't reach for that genre at all. It also focuses on the lives of 4 teenagers that are all affected by World War I and kind of their romantic relationships and friendships between all of them. Again, that alone is not enough to sell me, but what made me want to pick this one up that I was unaware of is that these characters' stories are all told from the perspectives of Greek gods and goddesses. So the whole setup for this is that Aphrodite, the goddess of love and affection, I believe, is put on trial by her husband, Hephaestus. I am not your Greek mythology gal, so please do not read me for filth. I'm doing the best that I can. But in this trial that Hephaestus puts her on for kind of being unfaithful to him, she, in her defense, wants to tell this love story, and she calls in all of these other Greek gods and goddesses. So we get to hear from Apollo, and we get to hear from Hades, and we get to hear from that other, the war god. I don't know, the war god, you know the one. Ares, the Greek god of war is Ares, wow. And so we get this sweeping tale of these 4 young people's experiences with war and how it affects them and how it affects their families and how it affects their relationships with one another. Don't ask me why this worked so well for me, because it's been over a month since I read it and I still cannot articulate it, but I lose my breath anytime that I think about these characters and their relationships with one another. Hazel and Aubrey and Colette, am I okay? I am not okay. Just, I think Julie Berry really knew what she was doing when she told this story of love in the time of war through the perspectives of gods. What really got me and what really tugged at my heartstrings and made me lose breath was the relationship and the investment that these all-knowing, all-powerful gods and their investment that they had in these mortals. I also really do appreciate when authors write war well, and it's not necessarily like the battle sequences, but really kind of the examination of what war is. And so we get Aphrodite's perspective of war from like this sort of love and passion that wartime can bring out. Then we get the god of war and kind of the brutality and the betrayal and the loss that can come from war. And then we also get Hades' perspective and kind of the death and grief that can come out of war. But we also get Apollo's perspective and kind of the art and the beauty that can come out of wartime. And I need to stop. I need to calm down. This was absolutely fabulous. The writing and the narration style is some of my all-time favorite that I've read in a really long time. Each page was like an individually wrapped treat. I savored every single word. The writing was velvety and smooth, and just, I'm so grateful to have picked this up. I never would have, and the payoff was huge. I struggle with my star rating, probably from what I've been saying. It seems like it should be a 5 out of 5. I just struggle with my 5 out of 5s. As much as I hate specific decimal star ratings, we're gonna call this one a 4.75. I'll re-examine later on, but 4.75 out of 5 stars is what we're going to give this one for now. Last in this category of books that are from genres that I don't typically read is The Duchess Deal by Tessa. This is an adult historical romance. I have never read an adult pure romance, much less a historical romance, but this was my first and I had such a fun experience with this one. I picked it up on a whim and I had such a fun time. It made me want to be wearing like a full-length period piece gown and to be running around like a Twilight garden with zany violin music playing in the background. I really don't even know how to sum this up because I'm not well versed in like romance tropes. I believe it's a marriage of convenience and the hero and the heroine don't really know each other at the beginning. They marry each other for convenient reasons. That's what a marriage of convenience is. And they slowly learn more about each other and fall deeper and deeper in love. Something that I really appreciated about this, I think, is that both characters are kind of dealing with their own past tragedies and traumas. Instead of the author having each character's healing process be so deeply invested in the other character, she really kind of had the characters heal on their own, just kind of alongside each other. And I really like and appreciate that. Not having the healing experience be dependent on the significant other in the relationship and having them be responsible for the healing, but instead the characters kind of going through the healing process on their own and then kind of having the other person for support alongside them. I believe that this is a first in a sort of series and I would happily pick up the next one, I think. I don't know if I'm desperate to pick the next one up immediately, but perhaps if the mood strikes me again in the future, I will pick up more from this series, or perhaps I'll pick up more historical romances. I'm gonna give this one a solid 3 out of 5 stars. Okay, well, I believe that we're halfway through, which is an accomplishment, maybe. My next category, I think that I want to do, what do I want to do? Hold on. Next category, let's do Jacqueline Woodson books, because between February and March, I read 2 Jacqueline Woodson books. The first was Red at the Bone. This is adult literary fiction, and it's a generational story. The whole setup for the story itself is that initially it's taking place at this young girl's kind of coming of age ceremony, and she has all of her family members around, and throughout the story we get deep dives into each family member's past, and you can just see how the characters really impact and affect one another, but also how their pasts affect how they are in the present. My camera battery just died. That's how you know it's getting good. Those of you that do 12 book wrap-ups like this every single month or regularly, just all the kudos and props. Teach me your ways. So this one really deals with themes and topics surrounding family and identity in terms of race and sexuality. There's also a bit of grief and how it can affect people through the generations. I've said this before and I'll say it again, Jacqueline Woodson's writing is just really, really it for me. The way that she crafts and conducts her sentences, I just am able to feel them so viscerally, and character emotions just kind of hit me right here in my chest. I listened to this one primarily on audiobook, and I do highly recommend that audiobook. It's a full cast of characters, which I think lends itself really well to the way that the story is told, because you're reading from all of these different family members' perspectives. But at the same time, I am going to pick this up physically and reread it. The audiobook reading experience got a 4 out of 5 stars for me, but I have a sinking suspicion that if I were to read this physically, it would have gotten 5 stars, because there are so many hops and skips in timelines, and then also hops and skips in character perspective. I really think it's just something that I need to see the words physically in front of me. There were some parts that I knew that there were connections that I was supposed to be making, but I wasn't able to quite make them just because the audiobook doesn't lend itself well to like flipping back and rereading things, if that makes sense. So 4 out of 5 for the audiobook. Still highly recommend the audiobook, but with the caveat that I do plan to reread this, and I do have a prediction that if I were to reread it physically, it would get 5 stars. The next Jacqueline Woodson that I read is Harbor Mead. This is a middle grade, and again, we kind of get perspectives and backstories for multiple characters, only instead of them all being from the same family, it focuses on 6 different middle school age students. I believe that maybe they're a bit younger than middle school, but they're all in this kind of self-contained classroom. And their teacher one day brings them to this room, and the teacher explains to all of these students that this is their space to kind of share, and that the teacher will not be in the room during this time. So it will just be these, I believe it's 6 students, sharing their stories, sharing their emotions, sharing what they feel needs to be shared. Anytime a story is focused on the lives of students and the hardships of students, it's just really going to kind of pull and tug at me. I don't know if it's because I'm a teacher or what it is, but this was absolutely phenomenal. It's got great talking points surrounding really kind of tough topics like socioeconomic discrepancies, but it's told through the perspectives of these young people, so it would be really accessible for other young people to read and sort of understand those kind of tougher or more mature concepts, I guess. I think that all too often adults kind of think that young people aren't ready to discuss topics like racism or capitalism or different things like that. But this book just proves that they are ready, and those are necessary topics, and what a beautiful way to bring up those topics. I really don't know if I'm doing this book justice. I'm not really gonna go into each of the characters' backstories, but I would say ultimately that this is a story centered around healing. It really just speaks to kind of the universal concept that you're not going to have the same kind of friendships like the friendships that you have when you are young. The way that these young people are able to learn from each other and help each other and heal each other is just so moving and powerful. Again, Jacqueline Woodson's writing, I cannot speak highly enough about it. Harbor Me is also going to be a 4 out of 5 stars, both for like me as a reader and then me reading a book that I'm going to put into my classroom and recommend to students. Okay, the last category for this wrap up, I'm going to title The Final 4. And it's just the final 4 books that I haven't talked about yet and I cannot put into a category. First up in our final 4 is King and the Dragonflies by Kacen Callender. This is a middle grade that centers around our main character, King, who is dealing with the recent and tragic and sudden death of his brother. And at the beginning of the story, we learn that King believes that his brother exists still on Earth, only in the form of a dragonfly. I didn't know going into this story was that a large part of it for me was going to read like a mystery. Kind of after the initial premise setup, there is a plot point where King's kind of estranged best friend Sandy goes missing, and then the story kind of goes from there, following King's thought process of where Sandy has gone to, if he feels responsible for the disappearance of Sandy, and then eventually discovering where Sandy is and for certain reasons helping Sandy remain hidden. Another thing that I've said before, and I'll say again, Kacen Callender writes melancholy middle grade like no one else writes melancholy middle grade. This, and then also their other middle grade, Hurricane Child, contains writing and stories that are heavy and slow, but in a way that just like sit right here on my chest and just gives me a very sort of magical feeling. This book focuses on what it means to be young and Black, and also grappling with sexual identity and what that means in terms of acceptance from family and acceptance from friends. Just a young person discovering all the ways that the world is set against someone like King. I think that this book is magical and healing and effervescent and absolutely necessary, and I am desperate for Kacen Callender to write more middle grade. I will absolutely pick up anything that they write that is middle grade. Both Hurricane Child and King and the Dragonflies confirmed it. This I'm going to be giving 4 out of 5 stars. Okay, book number 2 in the final 4 that don't really fit into any particular category is Parable of the Sower by Octavia E. Butler. I want to call this dystopian, but I think really the better term for it is extremely near future. This takes place in California, and every single kind of dystopian element are things that I think that the US as a country has been on the precipice of, or could very easily fall into should things tilt a certain way. There's a certain amount of lawlessness and homelessness and extreme lack of empathy from governmental systems, and then also apathy and brutality from police enforcement. It centers around our main character, Lauren, her trying to survive in this extremely brutal near future setting. The first half, we kind of get to see just what day-to-day life is like and her relationship that she has with different family members. And then I would say at about the halfway point, it kind of takes on more of a travel kind of plot line where Lauren has to escape her neighborhood and is looking for a place to go where she can seek more and seek safety and seek a livable life. Reading this just really proved to me that I think dystopian or near future settings are really kind of my genre. I think that I could read any book with this sort of setting and it's automatically going to get at least a 3 stars from me. I think that the dystopian or near future setting just really lends itself well to things that I appreciate. Things like characters stepping into their own power and breaking the mold and breaking out from society is just always a plot line that I think that I am going to want to read from. So many concepts from what I have read in a kind of modern dystopian, young adult dystopian, I saw where authors could have taken inspiration from Lauren and her story. Ultimately, I'm gonna give this one a 3 out of 5 stars. I'm not quite sure what's holding it back from a 4. Part of me kind of thought that the first half of just kind of the world setup and Lauren's interaction with her neighborhood and her community kind of dragged out a little bit, although I can definitely see why Butler did what she did because there was a lot of character setup and world building in that first half that I think was necessary for the second half to hit as hard as it did. But I think that I'm sticking with my star rating of 3 out of 5 stars. All right, second to last book in this miscellaneous category is The Serpent King by Jeff Zentner. This is a young adult, gritty contemporary that focuses on the lives of these 3 sort of misfit teenagers that all fit kind of that misunderstood, don't have anyone else to go to, so they find each other kind of character type. And the story follows each of their perspectives as they go through their final year in high school, so their senior year, and a lot of the struggles and the conflicts focus on the different characters thinking about what the future holds for each of them as individuals and then as friends as well. This book is kind of set in one of those small southern towns, and each of the characters understands and recognizes that they all need and want to get out of this town that they grew up in and are attached to. Just some of the characters are more willing and more able to do that than others. So I would say for the first 3/4 of this book, I was moderately enjoying it. I was kind of disappointed because I thought that I was going to be more invested in these characters than I was. I was kind of just mildly taking all of their storylines in. And then Jeff Zentner made a choice in the plot that really just kind of rubbed me the wrong way. Again, I don't want to get into specifics because I don't want to spoil this book for anyone, even though I think that this plot point shouldn't be considered a spoiler at all, but it kind of just seems like Jeff Zentner was writing this book to be one thing and then maybe kind of thought, hey, I really want this to be more tragic, or I want the stakes to be higher than what they already are. We kind of included this overly tragic plot point that had no buildup, and then after the tragic plot point happened, he kind of just carried on the final fourth of the book with what the first 3/4 were. So authors including tragic things happening to teenagers just for the sake of having their plot lines be tragic is just not something that I really want to read. I don't want to speak on behalf of the author, but just for me personally, I don't think that there was enough buildup for this plot point to be included. I'm gonna stop being vague. This was 2 out of 5 stars. I think it'll be my last Jeff Zentner. I did enjoy the writing for the most part, but we're just gonna take a long break before I pick anything else up from this author. Okay, I didn't plan this, but the last book that I'm gonna talk about in this video was the last book that I completed. The book is Black Sun by Rebecca Roanhorse. Reading this was my attempt to extend myself into the adult fantasy genre. Young adult fantasy is pretty much where I have lived, and I figured that if I was going to have a good first experience with reading adult sort of epic high fantasy, this was the one that was going to be the most conducive to providing me that first experience, and I think thumbs up. This did what I needed it to. I don't know how to sum up what Rebecca Roanhorse did in all of these pages just because there was so much. So let's go through the buzzwords, I guess. It's a pre-Columbian setting. There's a prophecy, there's ascension to godhood, there's a ship with a misunderstood ship captain and a mysterious mission and human piece of cargo. There's also this sort of high priest character and some espionage and political conflict going on. Here's how I know that I liked this book. I definitely had characters that I was more invested in than others. If a book is like a 3-star for me, especially if it's following multiple characters' storylines like this one is, if I'm just neutral about all of the characters, it's 2 or 3 stars, but I was definitely more invested in certain characters, Ziala and Serapio, than other characters. But because of that, anytime that we weren't following Ziala or Serapio, especially for the first half, I kind of just felt lost and that it was dragging on. One thing that I think that Roanhorse does phenomenally, and why this may work for you if you're like me and don't read a whole lot of epic adult high fantasy, is that at no point did I feel so lost in the intricacies of this world and this setting that I felt like there was no point in me reading it. Like, yes, there was some political things that I didn't understand, but ultimately the characters were just so real and so easy to get invested in that that's what made me want to keep reading. And I think that's what I'm looking for in my fantasy, is kind of those deep and lovable and characters that are easy to get invested in. I went into this not knowing that it was the first in a series, and I kind of wish that I would have known that, because I think that the first half of it does so much build up, and then the last half, particularly like the last 60 pages, are just non-stop, like boom, boom, one thing after another after another. But now that I know that there's a second one, or at least that this is the beginning of a series, the non-stop wild one thing happening after another right at the very end kind of makes sense. I do think that I will pick up the second one in this series. I also think that I'm unsure if I am an adult fantasy reader, but I still stand by my initial thought that if I were to like adult fantasy, this is the kind of writing and the kind of story that is going to get me invested in that genre. And Because I finished this so recently, I am not solid or firm in my star rating, but for right now, I think we're gonna go with 4 out of 5 stars. All right, we did it. Those were all of the books that I read in both February and March. I have learned my lesson. I will never again let a wrap up go unfilmed, because like I did it, I made it, we're here, but at what cost? If you stuck around, thank you so much. I certainly appreciate you, and I hope that you are having a fantastic day, and I will see you again very, very soon. Goodbye.